I should have known something was wrong the moment my son insisted on recording my reaction to blowing out 61 candles. But there I sat, surrounded by flickering flames and expectant faces, completely unaware that I was about to become the unwilling star in a performance I'd never agreed to join. What began as a quiet birthday celebration ended with me discovering that the people I loved most had been orchestrating my downfall for months, using my own kindness as the weapon to destroy me. The evening had started with such promise. My son Christopher had suggested we celebrate at Rosewood Bistro, one of those trendy downtown establishments that his wife Stephanie always favored, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, vintage Edison bulbs dangling like forgotten memories, and servers who called everyone "hon," regardless of age or familiarity. I'd taken special care getting ready, choosing my burgundy silk blouse and the pearl necklace my late husband had given me for our 25th anniversary. At 61, I still believed that family occasions deserved our best efforts. Stephanie greeted me at our reserved table with her characteristic enthusiasm, all perfectly manicured fingernails and practiced warmth. Before I'd even removed my coat, she thrust an elegantly wrapped gift bag toward me, tissue paper arranged with the precision of a department store display. "You have to open this first, Eleanor," she insisted, her smartphone already positioned to capture my reaction from the perfect angle. Inside the bag was a tiny onesie, soft yellow cotton, emblazoned with "World's Most Loved Grandma" in delicate script lettering. The fabric felt expensive between my fingers, the kind of quality that suggested significant thought and investment. We decided it was finally time to start planning for the future, Stephanie announced, her eyes bright with an emotion that seemed almost rehearsed in its intensity. "Right, Christopher." She turned to my son with the expectant look of an actress waiting for her scene partner to deliver his lines. Christopher nodded with a composure that struck me as oddly prepared, as if he'd been practicing this moment in front of a mirror for weeks. His smile never wavered, never reached his eyes in the way that genuine joy typically illuminated his face. "Absolutely," he agreed, his voice carrying a confidence that seemed borrowed from someone else, "especially since we'll have so much more room to work with soon." The words hung in the restaurant's ambient noise like smoke from extinguished birthday candles. More room. I blinked slowly, trying to process the implication of his statement, while the conversations at nearby tables continued their cheerful buzz around us. Stephanie leaned forward across the white tablecloth, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow managed to carry to the surrounding tables. "We're just so incredibly grateful that you agreed to this, Eleanor. Honestly, not every mother would be this generous with something so precious." The ambient restaurant sounds seemed to fade into background static as I stared at her perfectly applied makeup, genuinely bewildered by her words. Agreed to what? Exactly, I hadn't agreed to anything. Before I could voice my confusion or ask for clarification, Christopher rose from his chair with theatrical purpose, his wine glass glinting in the overhead lighting as he tapped it with his knife. The gentle chiming sound cut through the dinner conversations around us like a bell announcing an important ceremony. Heads turned in our direction, curious faces focusing on our table with the kind of attention that made my chest tighten with inexplicable anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment," Christopher called out, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this speech multiple times. "I'd like to make a very special announcement." Stephanie's smartphone appeared in her hands, as if by magic. the red recording light blinking like a tiny warning beacon that I somehow failed to interpret correctly. My stomach dropped as I realized this moment was being documented for posterity, or perhaps, as I would later understand, for evidence. Tonight isn't just about celebrating my incredible mother's 61st birthday, Christopher continued, his arm gesturing toward me with the kind of theatrical flourish I'd seen him use during his high school drama performances. It's also about sharing some wonderful news that will change our family forever. What followed hit me like a series of physical blows, each revelation more stunning than the last. They were moving into my apartment, he announced to our captive audience of strangers and friends. It simply made perfect sense. He explained with the logic of someone who'd thought through every possible objection. I didn't need all that space anymore, living alone in a 4-bedroom apartment that had once housed a family, and they were starting their own family now, ready to fill those rooms with laughter and new memories. It was such an incredibly generous gift from me, he told the gathering crowd, his eyes finally meeting mine with an expectation that felt more like a demand than a request. The apartment where I'd lived with my husband for 30 years, where we'd hosted countless dinner parties and holiday celebrations, where I'd nursed him through his final illness and learned to rebuild my identity as a widow. All of it was now, apparently, their inheritance to claim. Let's raise our glasses to the woman who made this dream possible, Christopher concluded, lifting his wine high above the table with a flourish that would have impressed any theater director. Glasses chinked together around the table in a symphony of celebration. I remained frozen in place, my fork suspended halfway between my plate and my mouth, my mind reeling from the public ambush I'd just experienced. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for my gracious acceptance of the generous act I'd apparently committed without my own knowledge. Christopher looked directly at me, his smile stretched too wide, too forced, as he waited for my response. Right, Mom. The question hung between us like a trap waiting to spring shut, waited with the expectations of everyone who just witnessed his announcement. The pressure was suffocating. Jennifer's camera captured every second of my stunned silence, documenting what would undoubtedly become the evidence of my willing participation in this elaborate charade. In that moment, I felt like an actor who'd been pushed onto a stage in the middle of a performance I'd never auditioned for, expected to deliver lines I'd never learned for an audience I'd never chosen. So I nodded, not because I agreed with what was happening, but because I panicked under the weight of their collective expectation. The smile I forced onto my face felt like it might crack my cheeks, a grotesque mask of compliance that bore no resemblance to my actual emotional state. The conversation moved forward around me, but I remained trapped in that moment of realization. As Stephanie launched into enthusiastic plans about paint colors and furniture arrangements, casually mentioning how she'd finally modernized those old-fashioned window treatments, I began to understand the true scope of what had just occurred. This wasn't a request or even a suggestion that had gotten out of hand. This was a carefully orchestrated public announcement of a decision that had been made without any input from the person most affected by it. They weren't asking for my home, they were taking it, using my love for family and my desire to avoid public confrontation as weapons against my own interests. Of course, you'll always be welcome to visit, Stephanie added with the gracious tone of someone granting a tremendous favor. You can even keep some of your plants on the balcony if you'd like. We know how much you enjoy gardening. Christopher nodded along supportively, adding what he probably believed was reassurance. We'll give you plenty of time to find a perfect little place for yourself. Mom, no pressure whatsoever. Maybe one of those lovely senior communities with organized activities and meal services. You'd probably enjoy having less responsibility to worry about. As I sat there, mechanically consuming food that had lost all flavor, I realized they weren't just claiming my physical space. They were rewriting my entire identity, transforming me from an independent woman capable of managing her own affairs into an elderly burden who needed their guidance and decision-making assistance. The apartment they were so casually redistributing wasn't merely 4 walls and a collection of rooms. It was the sanctuary where my husband and I had built our life together, where his coffee mug still occupied its designated spot in the kitchen cabinet, where his photographs lined the bookshelves like silent guardians of our shared history. It was where I'd learned to navigate widowhood, slowly rebuilding my sense of self after losing the person who'd defined half of my identity for 3 decades. But as I looked around the table at the expectant faces of family and friends, all apparently delighted by this touching display of intergenerational generosity, I understood that none of my emotional attachment mattered. In their collective view, I was simply an aging woman rattling around in a space too large for her needs, and Christopher was the responsible adult son making practical decisions for our family's benefit. The remainder of the evening blurred together in a haze of forced congratulations and excited discussions about nursery color schemes. I excused myself before dessert arrived, claiming sudden illness, which was, ironically, the most honest statement I'd made all evening. As I walked 4 blocks home in heels I hadn't worn in months, my feet developing painful blisters with each step, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that I'd just witnessed the beginning of the end of everything I'd worked to build in the years since my husband's death. By the time I reached my apartment building, struggling with keys that suddenly felt foreign in my trembling hands, I knew with absolute clarity that this birthday would mark the last celebration of the woman I used to be, the trusting mother who'd raised Christopher, who'd welcomed Stephanie into our family with open arms, who'd believed that blood relations guaranteed protection rather than predation. She was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would need to learn the rules of a war she'd never wanted to fight, armed with nothing but her wits and the dawning understanding that the people she'd loved most had just declared themselves her enemies. The sleepless nights that followed my birthday dinner became an intensive education in betrayal that I never wanted to receive. As I sat in my kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by manila folders and legal documents that hadn't seen daylight since my husband's funeral, I began reconstructing a puzzle that chilled me to the bone. What I'd initially dismissed as Christopher's spontaneous announcement was actually the culmination of a meticulously planned campaign that had been developing for months, possibly years. The first piece of evidence arrived via text message at 6:47 a.m., a response from my attorney Patricia to my panicked midnight inquiry about an old power of attorney document. If you never formally revoked it, yes, it remains legally binding. We need to schedule an emergency consultation immediately. Those 13 words hit me like ice water thrown in my face, jolting me into the terrifying realization that I might have inadvertently handed my son the keys to my entire life. I remembered signing that document with painful clarity now. 2 years ago, during my hospitalization for severe pneumonia, Christopher had appeared at my bedside with a stack of official-looking papers while I was still connected to oxygen tubes and IV drips. Just routine paperwork, Mom, he'd explained with what seemed like genuine concern. Insurance forms and emergency contact updates. Nothing complicated. Just sign where I've marked the sticky notes so I can help manage things while you recover. exhausted, medicated, and grateful for his apparent thoughtfulness. I'd scrawled my signature across multiple documents without reading the fine print. Now I understood why Christopher hadn't been requesting my apartment in his mind. He already possessed legal authority to make decisions about my property and finances. The revelation sent me scrambling through every file cabinet and storage box in my apartment, desperate to understand the full scope of what I'd unknowingly authorized. Buried deep within my husband's methodically organized filing system, I discovered a health directive packet from that same hospital stay. Among the standard medical forms was something ominously titled Limited Authority Designation for Financial Proxy During Incapacity, with Christopher's name listed as my designated decision maker. The memory flooded back with sickening clarity. Christopher sitting beside my hospital bed, explaining that these were just precautionary measures, standard protocols in case something unexpected happened and I couldn't advocate for myself. "It's like wearing a seatbelt, Mom," he'd said with a reassuring smile. "You hope you'll never need it, but it's better to be prepared." What I'd interpreted as a loving son's reasonable precaution was actually the foundation of an elaborate legal framework designed to circumvent my autonomy. The documents were crafted with surgical precision, providing Christopher with broad authority to make financial decisions on my behalf if any medical professional deemed me temporarily or permanently incapacitated due to physical or cognitive impairment. The terrifying implication was immediately obvious if Christopher could convince even one doctor that I was showing signs of confusion, memory loss, or impaired judgment. He could potentially use these documents to override my objections to his plans. The power of attorney wasn't just a safety net. It was a loaded weapon pointed directly at my independence. My hands trembled as I photographed every page of these documents, creating digital copies that I immediately forwarded to Patricia's secure email server. The evidence needed professional legal analysis, but even my untrained eye could see how expertly the language had been crafted to maximize Christopher's authority while minimizing obvious red flags that might have alarmed hospital staff or notary witnesses. The next morning brought Stephanie's surprise visit, and with it, the most chilling performance I'd ever witnessed firsthand. She arrived at my door carrying expensive coffee and wearing the kind of radiant smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes. "Thought I'd check on you after all the excitement," she chirped, extending a cup with my name misspelled in purple marker. "You seemed a little overwhelmed at dinner, which is totally understandable given all the wonderful changes coming our way." I allowed her inside, primarily because I desperately needed to understand exactly what kind of opponent I was facing. Stephanie moved through my apartment with the confident familiarity of someone who already considered herself the owner, commenting casually on furniture that would need to be donated and walls that could really use a fresh, modern color palette. She opened drawers and cabinets with casual presumption, as if conducting an inventory of assets she expected to inherit. Her running commentary revealed disturbing insights into their long-term planning, which appliances were worth keeping, which rooms had the best natural light for photography, which architectural features could be modified to increase resale value. "This built-in bookshelf," she mused, running her manicured fingers along the oak shelves my husband had constructed with his own hands over the course of several weekends. "We'll probably need to remove this to open up the space. It's pretty dated, and modern buyers prefer clean lines and flexibility." The casual dismissal of 31 years of craftsmanship made my jaw clench involuntarily, but I maintained my facade of confused compliance. I was learning that observation yielded far more valuable intelligence than confrontation. When Stephanie excused herself to use my bathroom, I seized the opportunity to examine her purse, which she'd left carelessly open on my kitchen counter. What I discovered there confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed the true scope of their preparation. Folded neatly among the usual collection of credit cards, lip gloss, and car keys were multiple copies of my apartment's floor plan, annotated with detailed furniture arrangements and room designations in Christopher's distinctive handwriting. But the most damning evidence was a manila folder containing printed real estate valuations, recent comparable sales data for similar apartments in my building, and a professional property assessment that estimated my home's current market value at nearly double what I'd imagined. These weren't the casual browsings of prospective residents. These were the calculated research materials of people planning to flip my property for maximum profit. The final document in the folder made my blood run cold, a preliminary renovation budget, outlining costs for removing walls, updating fixtures, and modernizing the kitchen to appeal to younger buyers. Christopher and Stephanie weren't planning to build their family nest in my apartment. They were planning to gut it, renovate it, and sell it for a substantial windfall. I quickly photographed every document with my smartphone, my hands shaking so badly that several images came out blurred. By the time Stephanie returned from the bathroom, I was seated innocently on my sofa, hands folded in my lap like the compliant elderly woman she expected me to be. But her most audacious performance was yet to come. With practiced theatrical timing, Stephanie placed her hand on her still flat abdomen and announced her pregnancy with tears that seemed genuinely emotional until I began analyzing the inconsistencies in her story. When I asked about her due date, she provided a vague estimate that didn't align with the timeline she'd established at the birthday dinner. Her description of morning sickness symptoms contradicted her enthusiastic consumption of spicy leftover Thai food that she'd brought for our lunch. Most telling was her complete lack of the dietary restrictions and cautious behaviors that typically characterized women in their first trimester. I watched her drink a large iced coffee without hesitation, consume alcohol-based vanilla extract while helping me bake cookies, and engage in animated discussions about intense workout routines she planned to start once the morning sickness passes. No genuinely pregnant woman in her first trimester would be so cavalier about potential risks to her developing baby. The pregnancy wasn't just exaggerated, it was entirely fabricated, a masterpiece of emotional manipulation designed to weaponize my maternal instincts against my own interests. Who questions a growing family's need for adequate housing? Who denies an expectant grandchild a safe, stable environment? They had transformed my apartment from my personal sanctuary into a moral obligation, making any resistance to their plans seem selfish and cruel. Over the following days, I began documenting the careful construction of their narrative across social media platforms. Stephanie's Instagram account had become a carefully curated timeline of our family journey, featuring slow, cinematic videos of my living spaces set to emotional acoustic music. Her captions painted a picture of grateful children and a generous matriarch, the beginning of our family's next chapter, and saying goodbye to Grandma's place, hello to our new home. The comment sections became echo chambers of admiration, so sweet of her to pass it down, and what a generous mother-in-law, and you're so lucky to have such a supportive family. Each post accumulated hundreds of likes and dozens of comments, creating a digital record that portrayed me as an enthusiastic participant in their plans. But Christopher's email communications revealed the most sophisticated aspect of their strategy. His messages to me carefully referenced our previous conversations about the apartment transition, discussions that had never actually occurred. He attached detailed timelines, furniture removal schedules, and even a Pinterest board titled Neutral Nursery Aesthetic that featured photographs of my bedroom stripped down to accommodate infant furniture. They were constructing an elaborate fiction that positioned them as responsible adults, implementing plans I'd enthusiastically endorsed. Every email, every social media post, every documented interaction contributed to a narrative that made me appear completely complicit in their scheme. If I attempted to resist their plans, they could present months of evidence suggesting that I'd not only agreed to their proposals, but had actively participated in the planning process. The most sinister discovery came when I found browser history on a tablet Christopher had left behind during one of his visits. Among the typical searches for baby gear and apartment listings were multiple inquiries about legal procedures for challenging elderly parents' mental competency. He'd researched guardianship laws, medical certification requirements for cognitive impairment, and legal precedents for family members taking control of aging relatives' financial affairs. The power of attorney documents I'd signed weren't just insurance policies, they were the foundation of a potential legal challenge to my mental capacity. If I refused to cooperate with their apartment seizure, they were prepared to argue that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about my own welfare. The pregnancy fiction wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was potential evidence of my confusion and inability to understand family obligations. I realized with horrifying clarity that they had spent months, possibly years, studying my vulnerabilities and constructing multiple pathways to achieve their goals. They had mapped my emotional triggers, documented my behaviors, and prepared legal strategies to overcome any resistance I might offer. This wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a sophisticated fraud operation disguised as intergenerational planning. As I sat in my kitchen that night, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my husband's death, absolute crystalline clarity about what needed to be done. The grieving widow who had signed legal documents without reading them was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who finally understood that the people she'd raised and trusted had declared war on everything she'd worked to build in the years since becoming a widow. The battle lines were drawn, and I intended not just to survive their assault, but to emerge victorious with my dignity, my assets, and my independence intact. They had made one crucial miscalculation in their otherwise meticulous planning. They had underestimated the intelligence, resourcefulness, and determination of the woman they were attempting to destroy. The weeks following my discovery of Christopher and Stephanie's elaborate scheme transformed me into someone I barely recognized, part private investigator, part undercover actress, part strategic mastermind, orchestrating a complex counterintelligence operation, while my son and daughter-in-law continued their performance as grateful children preparing to receive their generous inheritance. I methodically documented every lie, every manipulation, every piece of evidence that would eventually expose their fraud. The most challenging aspect wasn't collecting the proof I needed. It was maintaining the facade of the confused, compliant grandmother they believed they were deceiving. My transformation began with the installation of a small digital recorder in my kitchen, disguised as a decorative salt shaker that I'd purchased from an online security equipment retailer. The device was virtually undetectable, designed for people who needed to document conversations without arousing suspicion. Every interaction with Christopher and Stephanie would now be preserved in crystal clear audio, creating an indisputable record of their statements, contradictions, and admissions. The first major breakthrough came during what Stephanie probably considered a routine social visit designed to assess my mental state and reinforce their narrative. She arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying expensive lattes and wearing the kind of practiced smile that had once fooled me into believing she genuinely cared about my well-being. "Just wanted to see how you're adjusting to all the exciting changes ahead," she said, settling onto my sofa with the proprietary comfort of someone who already considered it her furniture. "You seemed a little overwhelmed at the restaurant, which is completely understandable given everything that's happening." I played my role to perfection, asking gentle, seemingly innocent questions about the pregnancy while mentally cataloging every inconsistency that emerged. When she claimed to be approaching 10 weeks gestation, I inquired about morning sickness symptoms with grandmotherly concern. "Oh, it comes and goes in waves," she replied vaguely, then immediately proceeded to consume a large iced coffee and the spicy leftover Indian takeout I'd offered, foods that typically trigger severe nausea in women experiencing genuine first trimester symptoms. "Have you started taking prenatal vitamins yet?" I asked with apparent innocence. Stephanie's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught the micro-expression of uncertainty that crossed her features before she recovered. "My doctor says it's still early for that," she answered, which directly contradicted standard medical advice that women should begin prenatal supplementation as soon as pregnancy is confirmed. "And when is your next appointment scheduled?" I continued, maintaining my tone of loving interest. "Next week," she said quickly, then immediately shifted the conversation to nursery color schemes, clearly uncomfortable with medical specifics that would require concrete details she couldn't fabricate convincingly. While she launched into elaborate descriptions of paint swatches and furniture arrangements, I excused myself to refill our coffee cups, using the opportunity to examine her purse, which she'd left open on my kitchen counter. Among the usual collection of personal items, I discovered a pharmacy receipt dated just 2 days earlier that told a completely different story than her pregnancy claims. The receipt showed no prenatal vitamins, no folic acid supplements, no pregnancy-related medications of any kind. Instead, it documented the purchase of regular birth control pills, picked up on schedule, with automatic refills extending months into the future. No woman genuinely trying to maintain a pregnancy would be simultaneously taking hormonal contraceptives designed to prevent conception. But the most damning evidence was tucked beneath her wallet, a printed email confirmation for a wine tasting event scheduled for the following weekend, complete with her enthusiastic RSVP and dietary preferences, indicating no restrictions whatsoever. The reservation was for 2 people, herself and Christopher, and included requests for full tasting portions of multiple varieties, hardly the behavior of someone concerned about alcohol consumption during pregnancy. I photographed these documents quickly with my smartphone, my hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. By the time I returned with fresh coffee, Stephanie was measuring my living room windows, discussing her plans to replace those outdated curtains with something more contemporary and photo-friendly. "I'm thinking we should document the whole renovation process," she mused, holding up her phone to frame potential shots. "It could make great content for social media. People love home transformation stories, especially when there's a family angle." The casual mention of social media content revealed another layer of their strategy. This wasn't just about acquiring my apartment. It was about monetizing the experience, potentially building a brand around their fictional narrative of grateful children and generous grandparents. My life had become their content opportunity, my displacement their entertainment value. Over the following days, I began paying meticulous attention to Stephanie's online presence, taking screenshots of posts that contradicted her pregnancy performance. Her Instagram stories from the previous month showed her at high-intensity fitness classes, complete with photos of challenging abdominal workouts and captions celebrating her flat stomach goals. No woman experiencing early pregnancy symptoms would be engaging in strenuous core exercises or boasting about her unchanged physique. Even more revealing was a tagged photo from a friend's bachelorette party just 3 weeks before our birthday dinner, showing Stephanie holding a martini glass and surrounded by empty cocktail glasses on their table. The timestamp proved that she'd been consuming alcohol well into what would have been her pregnancy timeline, either demonstrating remarkable irresponsibility or confirming that no pregnancy existed to protect. The smoking gun arrived during a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. I'd invited Stephanie to stay for lunch, and while I prepared sandwiches in the kitchen, she stepped onto my balcony to take what she assumed was a private phone call. With the sliding door partially open and my recorder strategically positioned near the opening, her voice carried clearly into the room. "No, we're definitely not actually trying yet," she said to whoever was on the other end, her tone casual and relaxed in a way that confirmed she wasn't being overheard by the person she was deceiving. But the pregnancy story is working perfectly. Eleanor is completely bought into the grandmother thing, just like Christopher predicted she would be. My hand stilled on the sandwich I was preparing as her words continued. "Yeah, we figure we should wait until we're actually moved in and settled before we start trying for real. What's the point of dealing with morning sickness and doctor appointments while we're managing the transition? This way, we get the apartment first. Then we can decide if we actually want kids or if we just want to flip the place and move somewhere better." The casual discussion of my manipulation made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to continue listening as she laughed at something her conversation partner said. Honestly, the whole grandmother angle was Christopher's idea, and it's genius. She's so desperate to feel needed and relevant since her husband died. We could probably get her to sign over her car and her savings account if we played it right. But the apartment was always the main target. It's worth way more than she realizes, especially in this market. When Stephanie returned from her call, I handed her a sandwich with trembling hands that I hoped she'd attribute to age rather than rage. "Everything all right?" I asked with apparent concern. "Oh, just coordinating some baby shopping with my sister," she replied smoothly, seamlessly returning to her performance. She's so excited about becoming an aunt. Everyone's just thrilled about the pregnancy. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and created a detailed timeline of every contradiction, every lie, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. The fake pregnancy was documented through pharmacy receipts, social media posts, and recorded conversations. Their property research was preserved in photographs of documents found in Stephanie's purse. Their renovation plans were captured in screenshots of Pinterest boards and email attachments Christopher had sent me. But I needed more than evidence of their deception. I needed proof of their intent to commit fraud. This came through careful analysis of Christopher's email communications, which had grown increasingly bold as he assumed my compliance was guaranteed. His messages now included detailed timelines for my departure. suggestions for senior living facilities he'd researched on my behalf, and even preliminary moving company quotes for relocating my possessions to storage or donation centers. One email included an attachment titled Apartment Transition Budget that itemized costs for cleaning, minor repairs, and staging the property for optimal resale value. They weren't planning to live in my home as a young family, creating memories. They were planning to flip it as quickly as possible for maximum profit, using the pregnancy story as justification and my apparent agreement as legal cover. The most chilling discovery was a draft email I found in Christopher's tablet, which he'd left behind during one of his visits to check on my well-being. The message was addressed to a real estate agent and outlined his timeline for listing my apartment, emphasizing the need for a quick sale due to family circumstances requiring immediate relocation. The email mentioned that the property would be available within 60 days, free of tenant complications, with all necessary legal documentation already secured. It referenced elderly seller, motivated by family considerations, and suggested that multiple offers might be expected given the apartment's desirable location and condition. They had been planning to evict me from my own home, sell it without my knowledge or consent, and presumably use the power of attorney documents to claim legal authority for the transaction. The pregnancy story provided emotional justification. The social media campaign created public witnesses to my apparent agreement, and the legal documents I'd unknowingly signed years earlier would serve as authorization for their actions. As I compiled my evidence that night, organizing photographs, recordings, and screenshots into clearly labeled folders, I realized that Christopher and Stephanie had created a nearly perfect crime. They had exploited my trust, manipulated my emotions, and constructed legal frameworks that would make their theft appear legitimate to anyone who didn't examine the evidence closely. But they had made one crucial error in their otherwise meticulous planning. They had underestimated my capacity to recognize manipulation once I understood what I was looking for. The grieving widow who had signed documents without reading them was gone, replaced by a woman who documented everything, questioned every story, and recognized deception with the clarity that comes from having been betrayed by the people you trust most. Their performance had been flawless, but my counter-surveillance had been better. Now I possessed the evidence needed not just to protect myself, but to ensure that their carefully constructed fiction would collapse under the weight of documented truth. The game they thought they were winning was about to change dramatically, and I intended to be the one controlling the final outcome the morning I decided to transform from victim to victor. I woke before dawn with a clarity that felt like emerging from a long, disorienting fog. No more playing the confused, compliant mother they expected me to be. No more allowing Christopher and Stephanie to dictate the terms of my own existence. As I sat at my kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the city skyline in shades of gold and amber, I began orchestrating the most complex and crucial performance of my entire life, one where I would appear to be exactly the person they believed me to be, while systematically dismantling everything they had constructed. My first strategic move was reaching out to Dorothy, my former colleague from the real estate firm where I'd worked part-time during the early years of my husband's retirement. Dorothy had transitioned into exclusive private property consulting after leaving the corporate world, specializing in discrete transactions for clients who needed to move assets quickly and quietly without attracting public attention or family interference. When I called her at 7 a.m. and carefully explained my situation, omitting the more sordid details while emphasizing my need for absolute confidentiality, She understood the implications immediately, without requiring extensive explanation. "Eleanor, you need to sell that apartment before they realize you've discovered their game," she said with the decisive clarity that had made her successful in real estate for over 2 decades. I maintain relationships with a network of serious cash buyers, people who prefer to avoid public listings, lengthy negotiations, and the complications that come with traditional real estate transactions. You'll receive slightly less than full market value, but the sale can close in under 2 weeks with certified funds and no contingencies that might create delays or opportunities for interference. Within 6 hours of our initial conversation, Dorothy had generated 3 legitimate inquiries from qualified buyers. By the end of that same week, I had received a firm, irrevocable offer from a recently retired couple named the Hendersons, who were looking to downsize from their suburban house into a city apartment that offered the character and convenience they'd been seeking. They were particularly charmed by the built-in bookshelves my husband had crafted with such care, seeing them as unique architectural features that added personality and warmth to the space. More importantly, for my purposes, the Hendersons were prepared to close within 10 business days using certified bank funds, eliminating any mortgage approval delays, inspection complications, or other procedural obstacles that might alert Christopher and Stephanie to what was occurring behind their backs, while Dorothy negotiated the final details of my apartment sale. I began searching for my new home with the same methodical precision I'd applied to gathering evidence of my family's betrayal. I'd always been drawn to the lake country approximately 4 hours north of the city, where my husband and I had taken weekend drives during the early years of our marriage, exploring small towns and admiring the peaceful landscapes that seemed worlds away from urban complexity. The region had evolved into a quiet retirement community over the past decade, attracting people who valued privacy, natural beauty, and the kind of genuine neighborliness that had become increasingly rare in metropolitan areas. After browsing available properties online, I discovered a charming 2-bedroom cabin situated on 4 acres of wooded land, complete with a private dock and panoramic lake views that took my breath away, even through low-resolution internet photographs. The seller was a widower named Frank, who'd constructed the cabin as his retirement dream project, but found himself struggling with loneliness and isolation after his wife's unexpected death from cancer. When I contacted him directly, bypassing real estate agents who might leave paper trails that Christopher could potentially discover, we connected immediately over our shared experience of sudden solitude and the challenge of rebuilding life after losing a spouse. "The place needs someone who'll appreciate the silence," Frank explained during our initial phone conversation, his voice carrying the kind of understanding that only comes from personal experience with profound loss. Too many people today can't handle real quiet, can't sit with their own thoughts without needing constant distraction and entertainment. I knew exactly what he meant, and I assured him that silence had become one of my most valued companions since my husband's death. Frank agreed to a cash sale with an expedited closing, asking only that I promise to maintain the vegetable garden his wife had planted with such care and to keep the bird feeders filled that attracted cardinals and blue jays to the kitchen window where she'd spent countless hours watching and identifying different species. While arranging my escape route, I had to maintain the elaborate facade of the grateful, slightly overwhelmed grandmother that Christopher and Stephanie expected to encounter during their increasingly frequent visits. This required responding to Christopher's progressively demanding emails about our transition timeline, with gentle acknowledgments that revealed nothing about my actual intentions, while reinforcing their perception of my compliance and confusion. When he sent me detailed Pinterest boards featuring nursery designs that showed my bedroom stripped down to accommodate infant furniture, I replied with comments like, "How thoughtful of you to plan so carefully, dear," and "I'm sure the baby will love having such a beautiful room." Each response made me feel physically ill to compose, but they were necessary to maintain the illusion of my cooperation while I prepared my counterattack. Stephanie's social media campaign had intensified during this period, with daily posts documenting her supposed pregnancy journey and expressing gratitude for my incredible generosity in providing them with a home for their growing family. She'd begun filming herself in my apartment during her visits, narrating her plans for each room as if she were a lifestyle influencer preparing content for a home renovation series. Her comment sections had become echo chambers of admiration and support. "You're so lucky to have such a wonderful mother-in-law, and what a beautiful way to pass down family traditions. And this is what real family support looks like." The posts were accumulating thousands of views and hundreds of comments, creating a vast digital audience invested in their fictional narrative. I forced myself to participate in this performance, liking her posts and leaving supportive comments that made my stomach churn to write. "So excited to see what you create." I typed beneath a video of her measuring my living room for new furniture placement. "The baby is so fortunate to have such thoughtful parents." The words felt like poison, but they were essential elements of my camouflage strategy. The most challenging aspect of my secret preparations was coordinating the physical logistics of relocating my most precious possessions without arousing suspicion from my increasingly vigilant family members. I couldn't hire traditional moving companies without risking discovery, so I reached out to Harold, a member of my church congregation who operated a small hauling and moving service from his pickup truck and trailer. Harold was discreet, reliable, and experienced in helping people navigate complicated family situations that required careful handling. When I explained that I needed to move some belongings to storage without involving family members who might create unnecessary drama and complications, he understood immediately and asked no questions that might compromise my privacy. Over the course of several carefully scheduled days, Harold helped me transport my most irreplaceable possessions to a climate-controlled storage facility across town where Christopher and Stephanie would never think to look. My husband's workshop tools, our wedding china, boxes of photographs spanning decades of marriage, and the quilts my mother had stitched by hand during my childhood all disappeared into secure storage, where they would wait safely until my new home was ready to receive them. I maintained only the essential furniture and personal items necessary to preserve the appearance of normal daily life, ensuring that casual visitors wouldn't notice any obvious changes that might trigger suspicion or investigation. The legal preparations were equally complex and potentially dangerous if discovered prematurely. I had to revoke Christopher's power of attorney without alerting him to the change, which required working through Patricia to file all necessary paperwork during regular business hours when he wouldn't expect me to be conducting legal business. Every form required notarization and precise filing procedures that had to be completed correctly. On the first attempt, there would be no opportunities for corrections or do-overs if Christopher discovered what I was doing before the process was finished. Patricia was initially skeptical about the extent of Christopher and Stephanie's manipulation, viewing my situation as a typical family property dispute that might be resolved through mediation and clear communication. Misunderstandings about inheritances and family assistance are unfortunately common, she said diplomatically during our first consultation. Sometimes what appears to be manipulation is actually just poor communication and different expectations about family obligations. Her perspective changed dramatically when I presented the comprehensive evidence I'd been gathering, the screenshots of Stephanie's contradictory social media posts, the recorded conversations revealing their fake pregnancy scheme, the photographs of real estate research and renovation plans I'd found in Stephanie's purse, and most convincingly, the audio recording of Stephanie's phone conversation discussing their strategy for manipulating me. Eleanor, this isn't a family dispute or miscommunication, Patricia said after reviewing everything I'd documented. This is attempted fraud on multiple levels. We need to move immediately to protect all your assets and create ironclad documentation of your mental competency in case they attempt to challenge your decision-making capacity through the legal system. The protective measures we implemented were comprehensive and designed to anticipate every possible avenue of attack. Beyond revoking Christopher's power of attorney, we filed formal declarations of my mental capacity, complete with cognitive assessments from a geriatric specialist who confirmed unequivocally that I possessed full mental faculties and decision-making abilities. We changed all my banking passwords, added fraud alerts to my credit reports, and established new security protocols that would prevent unauthorized access to my financial accounts. Most importantly, we prepared an entirely new will that explicitly disinherited Christopher and Stephanie while leaving my estate to a charitable foundation I created specifically to help older women escape financial abuse perpetrated by their own family members. The foundation concept was Patricia's suggestion, and it resonated with me as the perfect way to transform my personal trauma into something that could prevent other women from experiencing similar betrayals. You're unfortunately not unique in facing this situation, she explained. Adult children manipulating elderly parents for property, money, and inheritance is far more common than most people realize. The vast majority of victims don't have the resources, awareness, or support necessary to fight back effectively against family members they trusted. I named it the Second Chapter Foundation, with a mission statement that filled me with pride and purpose, empowering women over 55 to reclaim their independence after escaping financial exploitation by family members. The initial funding would come from the sale of my apartment, and eventually, the lakeside cabin I was purchasing would serve as a retreat center where women could stay while rebuilding their lives and developing new support networks. As the sale of my apartment approached its closing date, I had to become even more careful about maintaining my cover identity while Christopher's visits became more frequent and invasive. He'd begun arriving unannounced, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to monitor my mental state and watch for signs that I might be reconsidering or developing doubts about their appropriation of my home. During these visits, I made sure to appear slightly confused about minor details while asking general questions about their timeline and expressing mild concerns about the logistics of my own displacement. I'm just feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the changes, I told him during one particularly tense encounter, allowing a slight tremor to enter my voice. It's such a significant transition, and I'm not entirely sure where I'll go or how I'll manage in a new place. Don't worry about any of that, Mom, he replied with what he probably believed was reassurance, but felt more like condescension wrapped in false concern. Stephanie and I will help you find a perfect little place. Maybe one of those nice senior communities with organized activities and meal services. You'd probably enjoy having less responsibility and more social interaction with people your own age. The patronizing tone in his voice was breathtaking in its audacity, but I maintained my performance flawlessly. That does sound easier than managing everything here by myself. I agreed with calculated meekness. I do get tired trying to keep up with all the maintenance and responsibilities. Meanwhile, Stephanie had escalated her pregnancy performance to include detailed descriptions of supposed symptoms and doctor's appointments that I knew were entirely fictional. She made elaborate shows of declining wine during her visits, though I noticed she had no hesitation consuming spicy foods, caffeine, or other items that typically cause problems for genuinely pregnant women. Her social media posts now featured carefully staged pregnancy progression photos and captions about growing our family that accumulated thousands of likes and supportive comments from an audience completely invested in her fraudulent narrative. The most surreal moment occurred when Stephanie presented me with a framed ultrasound photograph, claiming it was from her first prenatal appointment and that she wanted me to be the first person to see evidence of my future grandchild. The image looked professionally authentic enough to fool casual observers, but I recognized it immediately as a stock photograph from a pregnancy website where it was used as an example image for educational articles. She had literally printed a fake ultrasound and presented it as proof of her pregnancy, filming my emotional reaction for social media content. "We wanted you to be the very first to meet your grandchild," she said with tears that seemed genuine until I realized she was simultaneously recording the moment on her phone for later posting. I held the fabricated ultrasound with hands that trembled not from joy, but from the tremendous effort required to control my rage at their continued manipulation. "It's absolutely beautiful," I managed to whisper. Such a miracle. That night, as I sat in my soon-to-be former home, surrounded by the evidence of their elaborate deception, I felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. In less than 72 hours, the apartment sale would close, and I would disappear into my new life by the lake before Christopher and Stephanie realized their carefully orchestrated scheme had crumbled completely. They would wake up one morning to discover that the compliant, confused grandmother they'd been manipulating had outmaneuvered them entirely, using their own assumptions about my weakness and gullibility as weapons against their fraud. The most satisfying aspect wasn't the financial security I'd preserved or the property I'd rescued from their scheme. It was the knowledge that I'd defeated them using intelligence, planning, and strategic thinking rather than confrontation or emotional appeals they could have manipulated to their advantage. Christopher and Stephanie had inadvertently taught me that I possessed reserves of strength, cunning, and determination I'd never known existed within me. Very soon, they would learn that same lesson about themselves and discover that underestimating an elderly woman had been the costliest mistake of their lives. The morning I drove away from my old life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete, liberating freedom. As my car pulled out of the parking garage one final time, I didn't glance back at the apartment building that had housed 30 years of memories, both beautiful and painful. Instead, I focused on the road stretching ahead toward my lakeside sanctuary, where no one could manipulate, exploit, or diminish me ever again. The phone calls began 3 days after my disappearance. 42 missed calls, 78 frantic text messages, and a voicemail box overflowing with Christopher's increasingly desperate recordings. "Mom, what have you done?" he demanded in one particularly angry message. "You can't just vanish like this. We have a baby on the way. This is insane." Even then, surrounded by the wreckage of their collapsed scheme, he was still clinging to Stephanie's pregnancy fabrication, still trying to weaponize their fictional grandchild against me. I didn't respond to any of their attempts at contact. Instead, I sat on my new porch each morning, watching sunrise paint the lake in brilliant shades of gold and rose, feeling genuine peace settle into my bones for the first time since my husband's death. Patricia had handled all the legal notifications professionally and completely. Christopher and Stephanie had received official documentation confirming their permanent removal from my will, the revocation of all power of attorney privileges, and legal warnings that any further attempts to contact me would constitute harassment. They didn't contest the will. They didn't attempt to challenge my mental competency. They didn't hire lawyers or threaten legal action. I think they finally understood that I had vanished entirely, not just physically, but as the compliant victim they'd spent months conditioning for exploitation. The Second Chapter Foundation had already assisted its first client within weeks of my escape, a 73-year-old woman whose adult son had been systematically draining her retirement savings through forged checks and emotional manipulation. My story became her roadmap to freedom, and knowing that my painful experience had prevented another woman's financial destruction made every difficult moment worthwhile. 6 months later, I received a letter that brought tears of joy to my eyes. It was from the Henderson family, who had purchased my apartment, thanking me for leaving behind the beautiful handcrafted bookshelves and sharing photographs of their twin daughters taking their first steps in what they described as the most loving home we've ever lived in. They had no knowledge of the drama that preceded their purchase, and I was grateful for their innocence. My apartment had found its way to people who would cherish it properly, filling it with authentic laughter and genuine family bonds rather than manipulation and deceit. Let me share something that took me 61 years and a devastating betrayal to understand. The people who truly love you will never try to take advantage of your kindness. Real family doesn't manipulate your emotions to steal your security, your peace of mind, or your independence. When someone shows you their true character through their actions, believe them immediately, not eventually. Your age isn't a weakness to be exploited. It's wisdom earned through decades of experience. Your resources aren't burdens that need managing by others. They're the fruits of your lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. Never let anyone convince you that your independence is a problem requiring their solution. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who treat your generosity as stupidity and your trust as opportunity. You don't owe anyone your home, your money, or your peace just because you share DNA with them. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't immediately articulate why. That uncomfortable feeling in your stomach when someone's words don't match their actions. That's not paranoia. That's your inner wisdom protecting you from people who don't have your best interests at heart. Your voice matters. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries with family members who crossed the line? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. And if this message resonated with your heart, please subscribe and ring that notification bell. Together, we can remind each other that it's never too late to choose yourself first.